Do you want to advance the first slides? So you have something you want to say with that?
If you can just advance them, I'll just go ahead and talk about the slides. So
There we are.
okay. I want to thank everybody to great decisions tonight. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I'm not really sure what happened, but it is technology. First, I'd like to thank our major sponsors, the Franklin Public Library Foundation, the Jerome J. and Dorothy H. Holtz Foundation, Carol and Tom Donovan in memory of Doris Sargent. Okay, John, if you could just advance it. Tonight, if you stay muted during the presentation, that will make it much more enjoyable for everybody. During the presentation and afterwards, if you think of a question you would like to ask John, just type it into the Zoom chat box. We'll read questions in the order they are received after the speaker is finished as time allows. This program will end at 8 p.m. While your question is being discussed, you can unmute yourself to discuss it with the speaker, and then please mute again when you are finished. One question per attendee unless time allows for more than one question. And it might.
I got a little ahead of you there.
That's okay. I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. John Katska is a retired senior foreign service officer with 37 years of federal and foreign service experience. He is also a Wisconsin native, UWM graduate, and a regular on UWM's TV program, International Focus. This is Mr. Katska's third presentation for Franklin Public Library's Great Discussion Series. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Katska. Thank you.
And thank you for that introduction. It is a pleasure to be sort of back in Franklin, even though I'm in Cedarburg and you all are wherever you are. Hopefully in 2022 will allow us to return to see how well we have all weathered this pandemic. Last week you looked at Brexit, and next week you're going to look at China and Africa. There are connections to our topic this evening in both topics, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. A couple of things that you might call housekeeping items. Though I was a government spokesman, when I was a diplomat, I speak for myself these days and have no responsibility to promote the official position. I do have a responsibility to be responsible, and I will try to do so. I have a perspective, and there are many perspectives on any foreign affairs issue, and it's important that you expose yourself to as many points of view as possible before you make up your mind on this or any issue. One of the ways in which perspectives are divided in foreign affairs is between realists and idealists. In recent years, I have favored the realist point of view, that is more pragmatic, national interest approach, as opposed to the idealist orientation, which focuses on values like human rights and democracy. Neither approach is right or wrong, but there are costs and consequences for either approach. With the exception of the last 4 years, when President Trump had more of a personal approach to foreign affairs, we have generally favored the idealist approach. Rarely is anyone fully one or the other, and one's position can and probably should change to fit circumstances. Also, a little note on my bio information. I regret to say that my TV program has become another casualty of the pandemic. Both UWM and NPR lost the funding to keep it going. Well, who knows what will happen in the future. I suspect that if we were not in the throes of the pandemic, supply chains would not even be a topic for great decisions this year. I further suspect that many of you haven't spent any time at all thinking about those supply chains. Well, let's look at a practical example. The chart of iPhone's supply chain is significantly simplified, but the chart does suggest that there is a range of entities and countries involved in its production. Though its contribution to creating the components for the phones is modest, China is critically important to the assembling of iPhones and can put together massive assembly lines of over 28,000 workers in days, which would take us months to assemble if we could find the workers at all. When changes in screens or chips or whatever can
Yeah,
happen at
I
any
don't have it
time,
on mine.
that kind of flexibility is
It's gonna be
important
on
to a
tonight.
company like Apple. At the end of the day, the opportunity for disruption in the iPhone supply chain is enormous. Globalization, or as it is called, the liberal international economic order, and liberal, and this is in the European sense of the word, of being pro-business and pro-free trade. Well, globalization is the concept. Supply chains are the mechanism that brings those iPhones and all the other things that you want to you.
Did you send it?
What do we mean by supply chains? Well, as you can see, Wikipedia's definition is a system of organizations, peoples, activities, information, and resources involved in supplying a product or a service to a consumer. Supply chains activities involve the transformation of natural
The
resources.
password for the Great Decisions tonight was changed.
Could someone who's not muted, please mute? Thank you. Transformation of natural resources, raw materials, and components into a finished product that is delivered to the end consumer. Yes, that is you and possibly your iPhone. Digitization fueled further speed, accuracy, and efficiency, allowing inventories on demand, allowing companies to operate wherever it made sense. To start, I'll talk about supply chains in general, citing broader definitions, dimensions, and in general effects on our lives beyond, say, those iPhones. Well, any discussion of supply chain has at least three dimensions. There's the economic side, obviously trade, just-in-time inventory, things like that. Then there's the politics and the national security dimensions of it. WTO should probably have be in the economic side, but there's more politics to the WTO than there is economics, I'm afraid. And then there's the critical product denial, like masks and gowns that we just recently experienced. And then there's protectionism, isolationism, and anti-globalization movements that affect the process. And then there's black swans, if you've heard that term before, unpredictable events, such as pandemics or technological breakthroughs. Though both are disruptive, black swans can be either positive or negative. In the case of COVID-19, we are definitely talking about a negative disruptor. According to The Economist magazine, supply chains managers have had a stressful few years. From the Sino-American trade wars and Brexit to COVID-induced restrictions on medical products, experts, and travel, there has been a lot to deal with. Offshoring, reshoring, or you could say bringing those jobs back home. That has been a constant refrain amongst politicians who have long argued for companies to shift production back home because they want jobs for their constituents. There can be as well a business case for bringing businesses and jobs back home. For example, to cut transportation costs or reduce inventories. The Reshoring Initiative, a group that advocates for more manufacturing in America, cites the allure of made in the USA branding for older Midwesterners. I guess that means good people like some of us. Frankly, that argument may work for some, but I don't think it is persuasive enough an argument to convince manufacturers to bring their production back home or to stop people from using Amazon to get that product they want at the cheapest price. And when those companies do come home, it is often with fewer workers and more machines. That certainly was the case with Masterlock that came back to Wisconsin several years ago. To that end, the experience of the past decade suggests that for every country reshoring production, there will be more doing the opposite. A survey of German manufacturers between 2010 and 2012 found that 2% brought production home. 4 times as many shifted operations abroad during the same time frame. A study published in 2016 by the OECD, that's the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, found that the effects of reshoring on national economies were still very limited. A look at the solar panel industry shows that presidential intervention, in this case by Donald Trump, to support domestic companies ultimately led to higher prices for those products because these new companies
Took a while. Okay.
were not able to compete with international competitors. So obviously, we have to look at the costs and consequences. You'll hear that term often in my remarks because this is something that policymakers, business owners, and international corporations have to think about as well as the national security considerations as we decide how we deal with disruptive threats. Nor does recent history suggest that new technologies will cannibalize trade. Take 3D printing, for example. In 2017, a report by ING, a respected global bank, predicted that 3D printing could wipe out 40% of trade flows by 2040. Well, we're not to 2040 yet, but the World Bank just did a study that found that 3D printing's use in the hearing aid industry, as an example, was useful for only part of the manufacturing process. And hearing aids are cheap to transport. And as a result, hearing aid supply chains were not affected. Of course, this doesn't mean that the future of 3D printing's impact will not be greater, especially in products that do not require major foreign inputs and where shipping costs are an issue. Gary Goretti at Duke University looked at the Adidas attempt to use 3D printing to make shoes in the United States and in Germany. He found that a lack of socially available components meant that the shoes had to be simplified so much that they lost consumer appeal. So you can see there's a wide range of influence and limitations to supply chains. The rise in tariffs in America and elsewhere over the past 4 years could, in theory, have been a game changer, encouraging companies to move supply chains nearer consumers. But there is little evidence of a great shift towards made in the USA following Trump's tariffs on Chinese imports. Although American manufacturing imports from 14 Asian countries fell in 2019, there was no offsetting increase in gross domestic manufacturing production here at home. As The Economist reports, at the worst of the pandemic, company bosses inevitably wondered if bringing production closer to consumers might help. So far, signs of reshoring are modest. Recent reports suggest that import growth is still growing faster than domestic manufacturing production. As I mentioned earlier, supply chains are a product of globalization, and their importance has accelerated since the 1990s. As a result, often those supply chains include production that stretch across several countries, as we saw with the production of iPhones. When issues like trade wars and pandemic strike, those multi-country production supply chains are stressed, affecting both the exporter and the importer. We're seeing it right now with the freeze in Texas, where chip production has been affected, and now also affecting the automobile industry. Under the current globalization model, there is little incentive for companies to revert to one country production. Such a condition would limit their flexibility and affect their markets, and importantly, market access. However, depending on how long this pandemic continues to affect the world's economy and whether the trade wars with China continue, these companies may be forced to revisit the question of bringing their businesses back home. The importance of supply chains questions can be seen in almost every hotspot in the world. We could be talking about transit issues in the South China Sea or the Straits of Hormuz, where Iran has significant control, or on a more global platform, dealing with the effects of COVID-19 or the effects of authoritarian governments, isolationism, nativism, tariff wars, and anti globalization, to name just a few of the possible influences on supply chains. Therefore, in order to deal with those hotspots, policymakers need also to consider the effect of their policies on those supply chains. There are costs and consequences to every one of these policy decisions. Half of our talk is about national security. Obviously, there is a concern in the United States about our trade dependence on China in several areas. It is one of the few areas where there is bipartisan agreement. But the story is more complicated. There are also Japanese cameras involved, Taiwanese chips, South Korean screens, Congolese minerals, to name a few, involved in just iPhones. We were already in a trade scuffle with China before the virus exacerbated the issue. Policymakers in the US from both parties want to examine the level of our dependence on foreign sources, especially from potentially hostile sources. Part of that examination will have to be cost and quality. Remember, those Chinese assembly lines I mentioned earlier as one of those costs. Putting together 28,000 people in a matter of days is something that very few places in the world could do. David Ricardo, an 18th century economic philosopher that you may have heard of, noted that countries should produce items where they have a competitive advantage. Reshoring, or bringing jobs back home, are still affected by Ricardo's observation. With this broad introduction to the concept of supply chains, now we're going to focus on how this works in particular countries and regions. Let's start with China, as it is the principal cause of our current supply chains concerns. If we were able to continue to receive the medical equipment that we had been receiving prior to the outbreak of COVID-19, I suspect concern would have been somewhat more muted in terms of the supply chains. Add to that the intent and the effect of the Belt Road Initiative, the BRI, a fantastic Chinese project to build supply lines and gain access, if not control, of raw material sources around the world. And you'll get more on that next week in your talk on China and Africa. And then there are those key raw materials and access to them and technology-related supplies. You may have seen recent reporting on the international auto production cuts because of shortages of semiconductors. US chip maker Xilinx is reported to say that auto industry will need to rethink its supply chains. And add to those issues China's more aggressive behavior in Hong Kong, toward Taiwan, and in the South China Sea. And we have a host of issues that flow back and forth from national security to commercial vulnerability concerns. Thankfully, you will have an excellent source for expanding on these dimensions next week. Mr. Rocamura's business background in China and Asia gives him a unique perspective on our relations with the region. Rick, you can send that check to, you know where my bank is. Other considerations, Brexit. Since you talked about this topic last week, suffice it to say here that Brexit is a disruptor to supply chains. The United Kingdom is among the three largest economies in Europe, and the rules are changing on how it deals with the EU and the rest of the world. And it is, or possibly was, depending upon how this all shakes out, Europe's leading financial center. Further, Europe is awash with anti-establishment groups who, in general, have little faith that globalization will benefit them. kind of similar to what we're going through in the United States. The Middle East. While the virus has reduced demand for petroleum products in the short term, the Middle East continues to be a concern for supply chains movements. The Strait of Hormuz is a potential blocking point for trade, especially with the escalation of aggressive relations between Iran and a consolidating Sunni majority in the Middle East. Warfare is widespread, and the miserable economic position of the masses could quickly erupt into widespread violence, another disruptor to supply chains. Now I'm going to go back to, there we go. Then we have these groups connected to the anti-globalization. This particular type of movement is primarily a developed country issue where a significant percentage of the population feels that they have not enjoyed as much of the benefits of globalization. We see some of these concerns in the polarization of our own country. Accompanying the turmoil in the more developed countries, there is a definite rise. In addition to that, we're seeing a rise in authoritarian regimes, often allowing leaders or parties to define how they want to deal with globalization and supply chain issues. Further, fear of control over their lives is fostering isolationism, nativism, with racism meshing well with anti-globalization movements. COVID-19 has fed into many of these isms, adding fuel to the resistance to freer trade and movement, and allowed or forced many of the world's economies to look inward. All you have to do is look at Europe today, and I suspect this came up last week in terms of the number of countries that are closing their borders even to other EU members. Even before he took office, President Biden issued a plan to rebuild US supply chains and ensure that the US does not face future shortages of critical equipment. Frankly, this was not dissimilar to what the Trump administration was saying about those critical products, especially after the pandemic struck. Both approaches, however, have to deal with some of the things we talked about earlier in regard to reshoring, supply chain realities, and multinational corporation goals. Biden's initial goal is to monitor the process, look for vulnerabilities, and close identified gaps. It's a particularly, I think I had written those kinds of remarks in my past as well. It's a generalization on a process because you don't have details yet. The plan promotes resiliency rather than pure self-sufficiency. In fairness, we have been able to protect a limited number of products and sectors from the vagaries of international commerce. Agriculture comes to mind as an area that many countries protect, and then there is the federal protection of the oil and gas industries. The long-time subsidization of the fossil fuel providers is controversial, and I will not get into the arguments for or against that tonight. However, if we try to build a domestic capacity to protect other industries like cyber interests, we will run into cost, quality, and quantity issues. Remember again those Chinese assembly lines with 28,000 workers. Also, US international corporations would require a powerful argument to agree to give up their supply chains, responsible as they are to their stock owners and aware as they need to be to what their competitors are doing and where they sell their products. Imagine my surprise while doing a search for anything new on supply chains yesterday to find that the president just announced that we are working on a global semiconductor shortage. No doubt part of the auto industry chip concerns. One of the first steps will be an executive order directing a government-wide supply chain review for critical goods, with the chip shortage a central concern. Relatedly, the executive order, expected in the near future, yet undefined, will call for a 100-day review led by the National Economic Council and the National Security Council, focused on semiconductor manufacturing, advanced packaging, critical minerals, medical supplies, and high-capacity batteries. The thorniest part of this process, in my mind, is keeping the national security dimension separate from the commercial interests. Finally, some of these national security considerations could be part of the infrastructure package under discussion in Congress. When I read the article in the Great Decisions booklet on supply chains, I found this very useful way in which to look at our options in terms of dealing with the supply chain problem right now. And this is thanks to Jonathan Chanis, who came up with these three options: renewed engagement, decouplement, and industrial policy adoption. On renewed engagement, Chanis suggests that those supporting this idea are growing smaller and come from older business types with a vested interest in existing relationships, and I quote him there. It also includes diplomats and academics. The principal message amongst this group is good relations are a win-win game. Certainly a message that diplomats could embrace. Decouplement advocates, he points out, see this process as halfway between renewed engagement and industrial policy adoption. Proponents want to find new supply chains to replace those connected to China, like with like-minded countries that we have a positive relationship with. Then there is the industrial policy adoption model. According to Arthur Herman at the Hudson Institute, the industrial policy is a program of economic reforms that give government extraordinary authority as well as fiscal and regulatory powers to change. And in this case, since we were talking mostly about China, China's economic policies. With a new administration, there can be new options, though the reality of what happened during Trump's 4 years do pertain. From my understanding of the situation, none of these options is really desirable in themselves, though decouplement is the more likely. Renewed engagement ignores China's continuing practices of ignoring or abusing accepted international economic practices. Decouplement and especially industrial policy adoption have severe economic consequences if applied too broadly. A more nuanced approach could be targeted application of primarily renewed engagement and decouplement using industrial policy as a bargaining tool. President Biden's pre-inauguration plan and his expected executive order on supply chains, as I mentioned earlier, has as its initial goal to monitor the process, look for vulnerabilities, and close identified gaps. The executive order promises to go well beyond the more modest concerns expressed during the campaign. Well, let me leave you some parting thoughts. Our current experience with globalization is not the first effort in the last 2 centuries. In the 1920s and 30s, as we lurched toward the Great Depression, countries increasingly leveled tariffs, protected home industries to the point that trade was seriously affected. There is no guarantee that similar moves could not bring down this round of globalization and the supply chains that it supports. We need to get a handle on the choke points in the supply chains. Stockpiling is one answer. We did that with petroleum. One of the consequences of this examination may be that just-in-time inventories will have to be modified. Another is a diversity of suppliers, especially with like-minded countries, that could be part of the decouplement strategy. The president's expected action suggests that the administration recognizes the threat. The question in my mind is how will they put this new plan this new approach together, and whether they will consider all those costs and consequences that I like to keep talking about, those intended and unintended in the plan. You may recall that after 9/11, when we added Homeland Security and the intelligence czar to the federal bureaucracy, or you may recall back in the 1970s when we created the Energy Department, our tendency in periods of crisis is to create new entities, new bureaucracies, because they are quick ways to look like we're doing something. Because of the nature of supply chains, an aggressive plan to rectify shortages and vulnerabilities will likely be slow in developing the structures needed and be met by counter moves, especially if we focus solely on China. Because of these considerations, I hope we plan early, but take our time on how we deal with these supply chain concerns, and that we work with like-minded countries in the planning phase as well as in how we mean to implement it. I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking for your questions and comments. Jennifer, are you there? Aha.
Yes, I am. Yep. Does anybody have questions they would like to ask Mr. Katska? Don't be shy.
Could you unshare your screen so we can see everybody, John?
Oh, that's a good idea. We got to go down here.
John?
Yes, where am I?
John?
There we are. End of slideshow, click to exit. Okay, there we are.
Perfect.
There we go. John?
Yes.
Okay, my question is, with the rollout of 5G and China, I believe the company is Huawei versus the US doesn't want England and the United Kingdom to use that base. They'd rather have the US products used. How do you think that's going to affect this whole situation? I got to believe this is an issue.
Of course, yes, it is definitely an issue. And we're very fortunate to have Peter on with us today, and he'll have to rob from his own presentation next week because he is in that particular phase. It's not so much U.S. providers of 5G; it's like-minded countries that we would turn to who aren't up to the same capability as China is right now on 5G. Isn't that correct, Rick?
It's a complicated question. I'm not sure I really know the answer.
Okay.
When I was researching Africa, they were talking about some of the Huawei systems being more adaptable to the certain circumstances in Africa. A more dispersed population in areas with less infrastructure, and of course the pricing of the thing. I mean, they just made it more attractive to buy from them.
Sure. Well,
so sorry.
There's two dimensions to this as well. There is one, not becoming dependent on China as the source, and two, there's a national security dimension, which is another national security dimension, which is the threat of backdoors in the technology. That there's a great book about a technological war. It's a fiction book, and I forget the name of it right now. That just goes into how China backdoored into the technology that we bought from them because it was cheap and available, and it broke down our capability of waging war in the Pacific. So that's it. I don't know that that applies particularly in this case, but it is a matter of concern.
You mentioned the ability to put together a factory staff. You use the word 20,000 workers in a matter of days.
28,000.
28,000. I went to a conference with Rio Tinto. They sponsored the conference in 2015 in Shanghai. And they asked all the business leaders, a lot of business leaders to join, and my company sent me. And one of the other guys is talking exactly what you're saying, how business friendly China was. How, you know, they cut through all the regulations. They, if you needed a team of people fast, they could produce it. They'd come, and they just couldn't get that anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
So it's just a very business friendly place to work.
Well, and if you look at the by my principal example, iPhones, uh, it is also an incredibly large market.
Yeah, that's right. I really think we have to just compete. That's so what I always tell everybody. That there are going to be areas where China's going to do better than us, but there are a lot of areas where we do better than them. And I think trying to legislate our way out of this isn't going to work.
I think we're going already down that road.
Yeah. I
mean,
don't think David Ricardo would approve of it.
No, he wouldn't. No, he wouldn't. But then again, Rick, you know, China doesn't play by the rules. And this is, you know, and China is a little bit like Germany after it unified. Europe had a grouping of the collective security arrangements in Europe of the major powers. When Germany became a united power, they hadn't been party to the agreements that were set up then, and so they started moving and pushing around, and we saw what happened out of that. We had World War One. Well, we had three wars: the the Prussian War, the World War One and World War Two. So China was not party to the setting up of the liberal international economic order. Actually, we were mostly the party to the setting up the international economic order. And so therefore, they don't necessarily feel they have to play by those rules.
Another observation I had is that in China, they encourage a lot of foreign suppliers to come to China to compete against their local suppliers, to keep the prices down, to sharpen the supplier's edge, may the best man win. They created a pretty freewheeling system. I was surprised by it.
Well, I'm not sure that that applies in the high technology areas.
Well, I mean, if Apple's an example, it's still Apple's largest foreign market is China, and then you have Huawei and Xiaomi and others making lower end phones in the same market. That's one. And then the lower end phones are competitive in third world countries.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think that's the concern in Washington. It's the national security concern. Other questions, comments?
I would just like to know, I'm concerned about rare earth minerals, and if we're going to be running out of them, and don't they mostly come from Asia or China? I'm not sure. Can you say something about the problems inherent with rare earth minerals?
Actually, this fits, and Rick will get into this next week because this is going to be a big topic on Africa. But China is a major source, and China has been going around the world tying up other sources of these rare earths.
There's an article in the Financial Times this week about rare earths and how, you know, all these elements are used in magnets and in a lot of our defense production, and they were saying that like John said, that China had cornered the market, and China was talking about boycott or having export limitations as a counterweight in the trade war. So who knows? Complicated world.
Well, remember what I said about globalization too. I mean, there is no guarantee that this goes forward just because we think it's such a good idea.
You know, have you folks seen American Factory? The movie, there's a documentary on Netflix called American Factory. And if you have Netflix, I highly recommend it. It talks about a GM factory that discontinued production maybe 2008, and then in 2012, a Chinese company bought it and started up again. And a lot of Chinese workers came to work alongside the American workers. And it talks about all the culture clashes between the two groups. It's very, very interesting and very well done. Won all kinds of awards. I really recommend it.
One of my favorite hobby horses in talking about foreign affairs is culture. We tend to look at the world, but actually most people look at the world through their own eyes, through their own culture. And when that's fine, and recognizing the differences between, but we have a very well put together program of democracy promotion, where we go into countries to tell them what they need to do in order to be able to become more effective and more efficient in their governance. And most of those models that they're using are based on our culture, not necessarily the culture that they're going into. And after the end of the Soviet, after the end of the Cold War, after we went into Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and places like that, we were very encouraged by the receptivity of these cultures to our ideas. And so we then tried to transfer that over to the former Soviet Union, to Russia. And what we found was that very different cultures. And in fact, right now we're finding that Eastern Europe has a very different cultural setup than Western Europe does. And we're seeing a lot of conflict between the two as well. And that may have come up last week in the discussions on the EU. Questions other than supply chains?
John, one other thing, you mentioned the raw materials, the lack of, and I'm sure it'll come up next week, but in Daniel Jurgen's new book, The New Map, I was telling Jennifer about it at the library. This will be, I'm sure, next week. He references, he's the foremost expert on energy.
Yes.
800-page book, The Prize.
I recognize the name.
And his new book, The New Map, he describes in Africa, the product cobalt, which is mined, and 55% of the production comes from one county in Africa, and it's used for all the lithium production for batteries. So
I spent 3 years very close to that county.
really, okay. So yeah, it'll be a big issue next week, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that's Zaire.
This is Zaire? Okay.
Or whatever it's called now. I was in Zambia at the time, and Zambia had cobalt as well as copper. Cobalt is one of the byproducts of copper. Well, are you encouraged by the political changes in Washington, or is this more of the same?
Too early to tell.
Okay. Well, it's not going to be as useful for Twitter, but it probably will help us in terms of working with like-minded countries. But there was something useful that came out of those 4 years, because it did shake up the the establishment in Washington, D.C. And that's not necessarily bad. But watch to see if they have to create a new federal entity in order to be able to deal with this. And you'll notice they never go away.
Anyone else have questions? Like John said, he could answer all kinds of questions about the world, because I think he's lived in a good chunk of the countries of the world.
And if I haven't lived there, Rick has.
Yeah, yeah. So between the two of them, ask away,
Well, I do have my biggest concern probably is that, well, we've reached peak oil and we're using oil in everything we make, plastics, and I just see that we're going to be running out of materials, and I'm wondering if you can say anything about that we really consume a lot of stuff. Do you see anything positive in the future, or is it just plain scary? I worry about it.
Well, I'll take a first shot, and I'm sure Rick. This morning we had our futurist group talked about energy and energy's future in the Biden administration, and are not at peak oil. Uh, Fracking has allowed an expansion of our capacity to produce fossil fuels and natural gas well beyond when they came up with the peaking expression a number of years ago. That said, we're seeing increasing evidence that both the petroleum producers, as well as a major consumer called the automobile industry, are beginning to focus on the post-fossil fuel world. And what we may find is that we will continue to have a need for those fossil fuels, but they won't necessarily be as critical a factor down the road in terms of what we need in order to survive. And you said plastics. I can't remember exactly the context, but I read something recently where they're coming up with packaging materials that are not petroleum based. And so if there is a need, if there is a market for it, people will come up with ideas. I mean, that is part of the optimism that we should have looking at the future. Um, it's not necessarily going to be easy, and it is especially difficult in such a partisanly divided country as we are right now. It would be nice if we could regrow the middle, but that's not where we are yet.
May I say one more thing? You talk about fracking, but it requires water to do fracking, and we have a limited amount of water too. So I personally do not see fracking as a good solution.
It's not,
Yeah.
well, there are very few things that go in for mineral, for recapturing things that are not invasive in some form or another. Mining in itself is, for anything, has been invasive. Uh, the substructure in Oklahoma, because of the amount of fracking, has been questioned as to whether or not it is an inducer of earthquakes. So there are consequences to it. I'm talking more in terms of the capability. I mean, look at the amount of sand that they get from Wisconsin on the Mississippi River as part of the fracking exercise. And one of the things that came up this morning is that Australia has enormous oil reserves underneath the desert in Australia, but they have no water available to be able to go after it. So just because it's there doesn't mean that 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 they're going to work. But someone may come up with another way other than water to be able to do it. Think positively.
Could you please just tell us your opinion as to how do you think like the trade arrangements with China will go under the current administration?
I see a that decouplement as being carefully approached. I actually see Biden as being a very careful player in this thing. And I see him as looking for and working with like-minded countries, meaning the members of the EU, with Britain and the what is the fore? Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and is it Japan? Uh, the like-minded countries. We missed an opportunity to be able to put that like-minded organization together when both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton said that TPP was bad for the United States. Well, it wasn't going to be a tremendous trade bonus for the United States, but it was going to be a political bonus because it excluded China in the process. And so we were going to have a mechanism of like-minded countries working together and coming up with ways in which to be able to modify or get China to understand what the rules are. I mean, let's look at it the positive way. Getting them to recognize that they need to change certain things that they're doing in order to be able uh, to be a part of this mechanism. So, yeah, I think it's going to. I think this Donald Trump shook things up. Uh, it wasn't pretty, but it wasn't meant to be pretty, and there was a benefit to that because it did get people very uh, thinking outside the box in terms of how we were doing things. We still haven't come to grips with the people who are not enjoying the benefits of globalization. Rural America is frequently not part of this process. Um, and that may also be one of the places where his political message was very well received. So the establishment was very upset with his being his election. The anti-establishment was not.
Thank you.
Any questions about Russia? Russia is not part of great decisions. I spent a number of years working on Russian affairs, both there and in the United States.
since you brought it up, what do you think about well, again, we've got a new administration and we've got Russia. How does that pan out?
Well, it all depends upon how we want to play this. I mentioned earlier in the talk that foreign affairs is divided up between realists and idealists. And a realist approaching Russia would say, what are our national interests in a relationship with Russia? An idealist will say, what is their track record on human rights, on democracy promotion, on the treatment of their people? Now, we have a tendency historically to be very idealistic in our foreign policy. American exceptionalism has been a refrain for 200 plus years. And what it basically says is, we're better than all the rest of you, and therefore you should learn from us. Now we modify that, but and this is where we get into these other cultures. Russian culture does not have an appreciation of the individual. It is the group. It is the family. It is a nationality group. It's larger entities than individuals. So how do we find common ground when we are all about individuals? In fact, we have become increasingly more individually oriented in recent years. So it's a very difficult thing. And since his party, well, actually both parties carry this banner of the idealism of calling countries to account for their violations of minority groups, of trying to poison an opposition leader. All of those things play into this. The question is, how are we going to decide how we're going to do it? If we were, and I suspect we're going to start by being idealistic. In Russia, we have an advantage right now because Russia is only a regional player, but they're playing around in the Middle East as well, and they are being more successful in the Middle East than we are. They have found common cause with Israel, with Turkey, with Syria, and with Iran. Now, that's not without some complications to that common cause, but we're excluded from those discussions right now. Partly it was because Donald Trump wanted to play foreign affairs as a bilateral relationship. If we're going to talk, he didn't like to talk about the EU. He wanted to talk about individual countries in the EU. This is also Xi Jinping's approach to foreign affairs. He likes bilateral relationships rather than dealing with multilateral groups.
Actually, kind of to expand upon the Russia thing, if Russia's more of a regional player, but yet they border with China, right? How does the whole Russia and China relationship kind of?
Well, when I traveled
right
in the Soviet Union, especially when in the 70s, where I really did travel a great deal, as you move further east, the Russians became more concerned about the Chinese influence. They've had dust-ups on a number of occasions, but right now, if they are both pariahs, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so they have become closer, but not necessarily. They have just very different approaches. Chinese culture is very different from Russian culture. China's is, from my observation, is much more efficient than Russian culture. Russia is in fact, it just muddles through. That's one of the expressions they say to us, why don't people revolt? Well, they just muddle through. until it gets to the point where they actually do revolt. But it takes a great deal.
Great. Thank you again.
Well, thank you all very much. Sorry we had trouble getting together tonight, but that's not a problem. We are prisoners of technology, and maybe we can do, if we do this next year, Jennifer, we'll do it in person.
Oh, God, I hope so. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, technology's great, but when it doesn't want to work, it's really horrible.
Well, and it's not the same. It's not the same.
It's not, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I apologize for all the technical difficulties. I'm still not 100% sure what happened, but it's not going to happen next week. Next week, we'll be listening to Richard Rockamora talk about China and Africa. So, yeah, I hope
And
everybody can join
he's
us.
probably going to have more to say than just China and Africa.
Which is great. Yeah. Yeah.
And here's the beauty of it is you heard my perspective on what is happening in our relationship with China on regards supply chains. Rick has another perspective, and as many perspectives as you can get help you be able to make a better decision in how that works for your mind and your thinking, and where you see advantages for yourself and for us as a country, as opposed to the downsides of some of those other perspectives, like mine.
John is definitely a realist.
I think of myself more as an observer. I am not an activist. I like to look at what's happening. Obviously, you can't know. Objectivity is a false premise. It doesn't exist. Everyone looks at everything through filters that they apply. And the worst thing we have right now is what journalists call journalism, because it's all advocacy journalism. We don't report on things anymore. We tell people how we think about them. That's an editorial.
I think you're very pragmatic.
Yes, yes. Well, it comes with age too.
Yeah.
So John, I take it
there's hope for me.
So John, I take it you don't think we should go in and rescue Navalny?
Oh, Navalny went back because he wanted this. Yeah, that was so Russian, his going back. He couldn't stay away. Now, was Putin responsible for Navalny? I doubt it. Are some of the organizations under Putin responsible? Probably. Just think of this way: he was poisoned, and then he was allowed to leave the country to go to Europe for treatment. That just leaves me dumbfounded. If this was an official attempt to wipe him out, why in the world would they let him leave? So, but it fits Russian culture. Russian culture is much more brutal, very beautiful in its classical definitions, but it's very brutal. None of the what's the Queensberry rules for boxing and what you do. It's street fighting. So again, we don't see each other. We look at what they do and we don't understand it, and they look at us and they think we're weak.
Anyone else? It's your last chance.
Well, it was fun.
Yes, it was.
Small audience are wonderful. Yep. Everyone gets to participate more.
Thank you very much. Thank everybody for coming tonight. Hope to see you next week. No technology problems next week, I promise.
Sure,
And-
Rick is getting a free ride.
Yeah.
John got the bugs out.
Well, last couple of weeks have been perfect.
I
So,
know,
you know,
I know. It's the Russian influence. The KGB was probably responsible.
that's right. I'm going to blame them. Yes. Thanks
All
for
right.
coming, everybody.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
coming.
Bye.
Bye-bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye-bye, Jennifer.
Bye, John.